Ladies and gentlemen, Brittany and I think that when we look at the conflict existing with Ukraine and Russia in the regions of Crimea and spilling all over the country of Ukraine currently, we see that this is a serious cultural and political conflict. This is a conflict that started as a result of issues with like the EU and in Russia wanting to have continued control over Ukraine, issues with the possibility of shutting off gas and things of that sort. There's a long history that exists between the two countries. And while we see that there is absolutely a firm Ukrainian culture, a firm Ukrainian language and status within Ukraine, we also see that there are significantly large portions of ethnic Russians in this region as well. We think the problem that exists currently in Ukraine is while there is much a claim by Ukrainians to exist within this region sovereignly with their ability to define their own culture, to define their own existence, we also see that there are ethnic Russians who wish to continue to remain affiliated with Russia, much like their pre-1992 and fall of Soviet Union. We think the problem that exists with this, ladies and gentlemen, is that these conflicts are almost irreconcilable. We think that there is a very little possibility of ever having the ability to have Russia be happy and the Ukrainians be happy occupying the same space, because we think that the desire to occupy this space expands beyond borders and expands to the desire to protect one's culture, the desire to protect oneself and one's existence. We think the best solution to this problem is to not continue hashing things out like we have with ceasefires in this region, where we see after the February 10th ceasefire, less than 2 days in, 129 violations happened of the ceasefire. Less than 2 days in, right? Like, we don't think these individuals are really willing to compromise within the same space. We think that the best solution to this problem is to have compromise outside of the same space by creating a two-state solution. I have a four-part model. I hope that this will clarify the debate pretty thoroughly, although I don't think this is a model-heavy debate, but I want to make sure that we don't have any complaining about that. So, first part of the model is that we're going to say that Ukraine and Russia are going to split the territory based on like the Russians within Ukraine obviously would like to go back to Russia. So it is going to be a Russian-held territory and a Ukrainian-held territory. Second part of the model that we're going to tell you is that the borders for that are going to be determined by an independent body within the United Nations. They're going to be obviously centered around like Crimea and things of the sort, but we're not experts. I'm not going to draw the borders for you. I hope that nobody puts that burden on us. Secondarily to that then is, or thirdly, really, we're going to tell you that the makeup of that body is going to include Russian leaders, Ukrainian leaders, and independent leaders, may include the United States. As we've seen, they've been pretty successful with things like the Oslo Accords and things of that sort. But they're going to be leaders independent of the European Union, because we think the European Union particularly has a vested interest in this region. Fourth and last part of the models that we're going to tell you during this split, during the ability to create these borders and create these separate states, we're going to have UN peacekeepers in place to deal with any conflict that arises as a result of this. We think there's already a significant amount of conflict in the region, and there should be more peacekeepers and things of that sort dealing with it. But particularly when we're creating this two-state divide, we're going to say that there needs to be peacekeepers in control of these borders until conflict and violence settle down. The reason that Brittany and I tell you that this model is necessary in today's round is because we think twofold. First and foremost, we think that there is pride in compromise. There absolutely is pride in saying that my sovereignty and my culture needs to be protected, but it can exist with yours, coexist peacefully with yours, without having to exist within the same space. But in addition to that, ladies and gentlemen, we think that there's also something to be said for firmness and certainty, and principles that were not carried out with things like the Israel-Palestine conflict, ladies and gentlemen, principles that were not seen in a lot of regions where we have conflict, such as with the Kurdish peoples in the Middle East, right? We think it's time to simply say, we know this is a conflict. We know it's going to continue. At this point, we are simply going to be firm in saying, let's stop there being a conflict now and simply create a solution before things go out of control. Go ahead.
Sure. We also think that existing in the same space is important, but you're not doing that. You're saying you can't exist with me in the same space. We think that probably needs more violence, because literally every two-state solution has been like that. Can you name me one where it's worked well?
Yeah, I mean, like, there's probably going to still be violence. I'm not going to fix that for you, but we think that we look at places like India and Pakistan, which did have a split, ladies and gentlemen. There's significantly less violence there now than there was pre-split, right? That's something that's incredibly important to look at. We think that there is going to still be conflict. Hey, that's why peacekeepers are going in, we admit that. But we think that right now, the world is going to look like it's going to have less conflict, less violence, because yes, we want them to exist within the same space. We simply know that's not going to be the case. We're going to be honest with each other about that. So let's talk about then two things in this round I want to discuss. Firstly, are the Ukraine and Russia conflict, simply talking about why we think this is not a conflict that can be reconciled particularly easily. And then secondarily, I want to talk about what reconciliation and solution actually looks like to this issue in terms of talking about pragmatics, but also principally what compromise is, and why we think that sometimes compromise can mean that you agree to disagree and simply separate into different spaces. So let's talk about the Ukraine-Russia conflict then, because I don't think it's like the POI that you hear, they're like, oh, we do want them to exist in the the same space, and it'll just all be okay. The reality of the situation is, ladies and gentlemen, if we want to look at what's happening in the Ukraine with Russia, is that you have a conflict that is Ukraine versus Russia, but it is Russia versus basically the EU and the United States in a lot of senses, right? And the reality of that situation is there is an unlimited bank, basically, of resources and an unlimited bank of hatred for one another to continue to fuel this battle. We do not think that the United States and the European Union are going to let the Ukraine lose, but we do not think that Russia is going to be willing to simply throw in the towel and say, like, oh, we'll just let the Ukraine continue to have this territory. We know that they rolled tanks into Crimea for literally no freaking reason other than they wanted to continue to control that area because they're struggling for power. We think the reality of that situation is that the worst thing you could do is say that the Ukraine simply only belongs to the Ukraine, when we know that there are ethnic Russians in the Ukraine that would like to continue to have an ethnic Russian territory in that area. We know that there are Ukrainians that would like to continue to have their own territory that is primarily Ukrainian. We think that the best solution to this problem, ladies and gentlemen, is we realize that what's happening right now isn't working, where we're trying to say that the Ukraine simply deserves its own space. That will not work. If you push Russia into a corner, ladies and gentlemen, that they continue to be told by the United States, continue to be told by the European Union, they don't deserve that space, we think that the fighting is simply going to continue because these two bodies, these two groups, are very complicated, have a very long history, and are unlikely to actually compromise in that situation. So given that, how do we get reconciliation? Because Brittany and I are going to tell you that we think that there is pride in agreeing to disagree. We think that there absolutely is this ability to say that, like, right now, we know there is a problem. We know there's going to continue to be a problem. And the best solution to this issue is to actually make a decision now. Not to wait it out and hope things are going to be okay, like so many other conflicts have happened with the Kurdish peoples, with the situation in Israel and Palestine, ladies and gentlemen. We think it's simply time to say, we know this hasn't worked in the past, and we know it's not going to work here given the history that these two groups have. They are unwilling to compromise, they are unwilling to reconcile their differences, and we've seen this work in places before, ladies and gentlemen. If we look at places like India and Pakistan, if we look at places like Hong Kong and China, sometimes we know that the best solution is to simply agree to disagree and understand that if we do not go to war with one another, we have the ability to create a society much smoother. We think not going to war with one another is a lot easier if you have your own space, you have your own place to disagree, you have your own place to determine your culture. We think the best solution to this problem is to separate the two and allow them to stop fighting over territory and culture.
This House would like to thank the Prime Minister and welcome the Leader of Opposition.
Madam Speaker, I think government is going to have a really hard time successfully coming up here and giving you an example of where a two-state solution has worked. Why? Because two-state solutions don't work. We've never seen this happen. I'll answer every example she's given you because you can't just separate off ethnicities and blow off the problems that exist between them and call that a solution to problems that will exist forever if you allow it to happen. That is exactly what they're advocating and what Steve and I are firmly against on this side of the House. I'm going to bring you two pieces of matter. One, how this worsens ethnic violence, and two, how one-state solution in this situation is the only way to have any sort of long-term solvency in solving the crisis. Let's get on to some rebuttal first. She says that they've broken a ceasefire after 2 days of the ceasefire taking place and thus can't resolve the problem. But she doesn't tell you why that happened, right? The reason is because the ethnic Ukrainians and Russians were fighting over a border city that was a railroad hub, because of the ethnicity split in the city being about 50-50. These kinds of situations get worse where now you're literally battling over the nationality of those people there, right? We've seen at least that fighting went away after a couple of days. It only prolongs itself when the identity of that nationality is different. Next, her example is India-Pakistan. 3 responses. 1, literally more armed than the North Korea-South Korea border, literally the most armed place in the world. 2, field generals have nuclear missile codes, that's probably not cool. 3, there were literally decades of fighting that went on after the borders were split, right? We don't think this is a great example of where that could possibly work. And then she's like, well, Hong Kong, part of China, right? Not a two-state solution. She needs to go here and tell me why these situations have actually succeeded, why this is the same paradigm that's going to work for Ukraine. Finally, she says Russia's just not going to back down, thus we might as well cave in, right? 1, we think they will, because we think that Russia really wants one thing, and that is the respect of the ethnic Russians in the region. We think that the Russian ideology has always been, we respect our brothers. Russia never actually wanted to have the Ukraine as its territory, or it wouldn't have made the land separate in the first place. But two, we think Russia is on its ass right now with having the oil industry so far behind, with having pressure internationally, with already facing all these issues from the UN, from the US. We think that all Russia wants is its brother and respected. I'm going to tell you how that's going to happen better under the status quo, but how they simply make that worse and aggravate Russia even more. Let's talk about ethnic violence, right? Because opposition ultimately paints you a picture that isn't entirely accurate of what the Ukrainian situation has looked like recently. We have to look at Ukraine for what it truly is. And there's two things that we think you lead to when you allow a two-state solution to be the primary solution for the problem. One is an internal ethnic violence increase that sustains itself, and two, a constant two-state violence that sustains itself even without the ethnic problem. So let's talk about the ethnic violence, right? Because we think almost no place in Ukraine has 100% ethnicity of either identity, right? She even concedes this in her speech. We can look at Donetsk as an example, with a 70% Russian majority and a 30% ethnic Ukrainian minority. But even in the West, where you have a majority of ethnic Ukrainians, you still have 40-30% of people living in towns that are ethnic Russian, right? So you see that the ethnicity is never a perfect split. Now, why for the most part have a lot of these regions continue to cooperate despite the differences? One, we think the rebels are afraid of alienating the population because they need support on their side. But two, and most importantly, is that although people identify with their ethnicity, we think in the region people still have a very strong identity to their nationality, right? So even though I might differ with you because I'm ethnic Russian and you are ethnic Ukrainian, the nationality still plays an imperative role in their identity, and thus they refrain from doing things like alienating themselves from their brethren, like killing each other in most of the regions throughout the country. Now, why do you change this? Because we think the renationalization, the re-identification of who you are as an individual and what nationality serves you is necessarily the problem that we see. We think you lead to two issues. One, they have to bite one of these. One, either you literally force move everyone into whatever nation their ethnicity identifies with. Morally, I think that's kind of an issue. If you want to engage in that debate, we'd be glad to do it. But two, we think that people probably are going to move, but a lot of people don't want to move because they do identify with the land that they're in. They do identify with their home. So you alienate these people who don't match this nationality with ethnicity. And we think what this leads to a problem is a further sense of ethnic violence because you now identify your ethnicity with your nationality and hate those who aren't like you. Where has this happened? Literally every two-state solution. Palestine, right? I don't need to talk about that one a lot. But the Balkans, the fact that you, as a Kosovaran, you literally can't go to Serbia without the fear that you're going to be shot by the police or arrested at the border, right? These kinds of situations in the Balkans where we've seen this be a significant problem. But we even see it in Ukraine, right? Because when Russia took Crimea, they wouldn't allow any ethnic Ukrainians to have property, to take a job. These are the situations that Russia used the exact paradigm that we're saying is going to happen at a macro level in the status quo. This is why the two-state solution necessarily leads to both the ethnic and the national violence. But let's further this, right? Because we think additionally, we'll talk about the manufacturing of particular question.
Okay, but Trevor, you're coming here with the assumption that these people will refuse to move. But yet during the communist times, we saw people move throughout Russia. Why can't these people move and we'll see some sort of peace, whereas your plan brings no peace?
Nate, so you want to argue that literally everyone's going to want to move, right? I just don't think that's realistic. I think that even in situations where people did move, that still there were people that were left behind. Unless you want to trail of tears your argument and argue why that is a good solution, I think that you have to fight the fact that not everyone's going to want to move and you're going to have this violence that we're talking about. Alright, so let's talk about the manufacturing, because there is no manufacturing in the western portion, right? So you think all of the manufacturing in Ukraine exists in the east. So what happens is that now you have literally an economy with no economy, and we think that leads to a lot of problems. We think there's going to be fighting over that ownership. But also it comes down to territorial stuff. What about the Ukrainian port in Mariupol? The only port that the Ukrainian side has left that accesses into the water would be from the line, I guess they're drawing, be taken into the Russian territory. We think that just leads to more violence. The theme developing here is that it's probably not going to go very well. But why is this quo solving a lot better? One, we see ceasefires that have actually had the ability to sustain themselves in a way that has worked better. They're getting better. We don't give you any short-term solution to this problem. We think long-term it's best. But also, The Ukrainian government has given those who live in the East and identify as Russian the right to have Russian as their official language in portions of East Ukraine. The ability to identify in the ethnicity that they have chosen. They have not done the same thing Russia has done when it takes over that territory. We think these kinds of solutions show how the status quo is solving, but also where the one-state solutions have worked. Like Malaysia, even though it's 40% Malay, 30% Chinese, we think in Uganda, even though there's such a huge split, the long-term solution, the end of violence, has happened when we get over our ethnic differences and don't separate people because they look different from each other.
So I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
To you about that, what the context of what's happening between Russia and Ukraine right now. What I'm going to do is expand upon this as to why this issue right now is not able to be solved under particularly the rhetoric we heard on the last speaker, because he says the status quo is solving. That's ludicrous, right? Like, I think if you turn on the news, I think if why we're having debate, the status quo unfortunately is not solving. That's why we're called to say that this policy, why they're doing like more harm than good, which my partner and I will prove that this is just simply not true, right? So let me bring to you, the first point is going to be when is it time to like let it go, right? Because we think that right now, it's a particular problem between the East and the West. There are some wars, there are some situations in which ideologies like can't come to terms with each other, and we accept that and we're realists on our side of the house. And the second is going to be the actual effect on the people, because we act like these are just two nations. They're just like, I don't know, like hanging out with each other, and it's just the leaders that are affected, but they're not, right? There are people on the ground. What do they want? Because we think it was largely misrepresented by the last speaker, Trevor. So, before I, yeah, there you go. Okay, so, let me go to some direct refutation. We hear about this ethnicity and nationality. Look, they've already taken polls, right? These individuals, it's not like we're coming up here and saying, I think that they want to be part of Russia. They've taken polls. These individuals, there are a substantial amount. That's why they've taken it to the streets to say that I want to identify myself more than just a language of being able to say my official language is Russian, right? If that was enough, they wouldn't be arguing and fighting and having wars and battles with each other. It's not enough. They need to identify themselves as more. We heard coming from the last speaker, they said if you want to have the moral debate as saying your ethnicity is like, I guess, stronger than your nationality and you should belong with those people, sure, let's freaking have it. We're fine with that on our side of the house, because we think right now people are identifying more with their ethnicity than this nationality that they claim that they identify with more. Why? Because there's a cultural difference. It's that East and West mentality that I'm going to talk to you about, and it weighs far more than the opposition would like to admit to you. We think that overall he gives you this idea with like the port. Okay, sure, maybe this port's going to be given to Russia. What's going to happen now? We're going to see that the Ukraine is going to be supported by the EU. Worst case scenario, even if they lose this port, they're going to have a hell of a lot less blood and like warfare on the streets, and they're also going to have the help by the EU. We think quite a large actor to have them backing. We take that on the head, and overall we don't think it's a good enough reason to say the language situation is really solving right now. Clearly it's not. That's why my partner and I are here today before I continue going.
Yeah, Russia literally just wants the respect for its culture. By doing things like saying you can have your language, that's what's solving in the long term.
No, it's not. And in theory, that's what they want. It's like their culture to be respected. It's not being respected, particularly when you have Western actors from the EU trying to get involved, I don't know, like Germany, who's taking a big stronghold on it, and not respecting that of Russia, right? Okay, let's go into the pragmatics, right? East and West, this different ideology. Because this whole idea of like Ukraine being able to somehow be put together with these two different types of people is kind of crazy. Because there was Austria and Hungary, which was the Western powers, and then Russian-speaking individuals, which were in the other regions. We think that there are sometimes ideological and religious wars that simply cannot be solved, right? And we recognize that. We heard coming from refutation out of the last speaker saying, oh yeah, when it comes to India and Pakistan, like that this wasn't good enough and that they're still having war go on there. It's sure as a hell of a lot better than separating themselves, right? And the thing is that they bring up to you this idea with the minorities. There are still some Muslims that live in India and some Hindu individuals that live in Pakistan. If these individuals identify with their nationality so much, they may choose to stay there. Unfortunately, the majority of them don't, and that rhetoric is just false. If that is the case, they need to be able to identify themselves with their ethnicity, and why is this so important? Because we've seen right now that the Ukrainian politicians have discredited themselves. The opposition leader is not being entrusted by everyone inside of the region region inside of that country. That country is barely able to sustain itself. So I think this rhetoric of saying, let's have the one-state solution, that's right now, and it's not solving. That's why we see that there is so many problems. We think that with Russian meddling of 80,000 Russian troops going from different areas when it comes to the north, east, and south, no. They don't just simply want respect from the West, right? It's so much more than this theological way of saying, we just want their language to be respected. They want a hell of a lot more, and it's not just Russia that wants more, but it's also the individuals that live there. There's been polls being taken. In mid-April, that's why they had the Geneva Convention, because they had one idea, which was to de-escalate the conflict, and that has not happened. If that has not happened, we can see this type of rhetoric of this one-state solution isn't actually happening. It's not benefiting any individuals, but let's talk about those individuals, which is going on to my second point of positive matter. Because we think that there's a fundamental difference in when you talk about what individuals want that are in the Ukraine, right? Because a lot of this came down to what my partner started to talk to you about, of them wanting to join the EU. The EU, besides we learned from the last round if they would take away sovereignty from nations, is supposed to be a democratic group, right? That is a democratic actor. That is a fundamentally different ideology and place than that of Russia. There are individuals who identify with a more Eastern way of thinking, and we respect that, because realistically, those differences do matter. Why is this? Because we think that when they talk to you about Russia being held behind, okay, one, they're number one in natural gas reserves, right? They have the capability, if they feel like they're not being respected, to go ahead and do a hell of a lot like they have in the past. They're able to keep oil for other countries. They're able to say that we're going to screw you over, EU. We're going to affect your economy. We're going to affect your people. So why do we think it's so important that we respect everybody across the board? Because we think that when it comes to this mentality of people that live in Ukraine and maybe being pro-West more, they identify with a different type of social structure, right? They identify with different set of values. That's why they want to join the EU. They see that there's different benefits of that. That's an opt-in system in the EU, right? They want to go ahead and do that. But the other individuals that identify with the Russian way of life, maybe that, and it being Eastern, more collective. They identify with this different type of ideology of what they happen to believe in, the main language that they speak. And it's not being done right now. This type of rhetoric saying that they're going to be able to be respected in their country is just simply not happening. My partner gave you the example of China and Hong Kong. They were like, haha, it's still a part of China, right? The point of it is that they still have separate governments, they still have separate ways of functioning. That's why we think that there needs to be a two-state solution. We think that just because there have been situations that haven't happened in the past, there are very few people that say that there should not be an independent Kurdistan. There are many people that have come to the conclusion that there needs to be that difference. Why? Because they can't come to the table and they can't just say, oh, we'll go ahead and respect your different language. At the point of where the status quo is not solving, at the point of where these people have taken it to the streets, have been polled, have said that this is an East versus West mentality, and not just that of being able to sit at a table and come to a consensus, we are so proud to propose this motion. Thank you.
House would like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister and welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Madam Speaker, the opening government failed to make their case when they did not indict the status quo. They tell you that conflict is going on, but sorry, saying that there was still firing going on February 12th is not indicting the status quo. We tell you, yes, there was a breach of the ceasefire for a couple of days because they fought over border towns, which is what's going to happen under your plan, but there isn't any more. Why? Because they accepted the ceasefire, because they realized that Western Ukraine, Poroshenko, and the government in Kiev is willing to negotiate and give them almost full autonomy, but not a separate state. When they talk about Hong Kong, the one state, key one state, two-system solution, that is what Ukraine is proposing. A one-state, two-system solution. That will work better. That's what they advocate for. Probably should have been on off. Get into a little bit of direct rebuttal, and then I want to talk to you about why a two-state solution ideologically should never happen in these certain circumstances, and secondarily, what precedents we set on the international stage. Let's get into a little bit of direct rebuttal. So they keep on saying the ceasefire is not working, or else we wouldn't be having this debate. No, sorry, it is your job to say why the ceasefire is not working. We tell you that it is working, that the last violence was literally February 12th. They can't tell you when the last shot was fired because it hasn't been for a while. We think that's a good thing, and we shouldn't try to poke Russia or Ukraine for them to fire more shots. They also say they need more than language. Yes, they're giving them more than language. They're giving them things like regional autonomy. making it look a lot like what you see in Hong Kong, this one state, two solution, where they can do things like have holidays in their region that reflect their culture, or do things like decide what they want based on their background. We think that this is very important, and this is what they're asking for. That is why they accepted the ceasefire agreement. She also tells you that the port of Maripol is not a big deal. Well, first of all, we're telling you that they literally fought over this transportation hub, this railroad hub, for 2 days after the ceasefire. If you split up the state and say you get some certain really important cities, it will only provoke violence. That's what my partner tells you. This violence is going to be state-on-state violence where you kill a whole lot more people than the insurgency violence that you currently see in the status quo, because interstate violence kills a whole lot more than intrastate violence. Why is this particularly problematic? Because you perpetuate the conflict. They've proven that they're willing to fight over these border cities, and that is exactly what they're going to do. They're saying, well, that's not going to happen because UN peacekeepers are going to be there. Right? UN peacekeepers have never stopped any violence ever. Like, they also say that if they stay, they will identify with the state. Sorry, some people may not identify with the state, but they would prefer to have a business that provides their livelihood, and that business is in eastern Ukraine, and they identify as an ethnic Ukrainian. We think that you cannot make them move, but they will be isolated, otherized, they will be abused, and we're not okay with that. You hear out of Nate's argument that they moved all the time under Stalin. Yes, because they made him move and literally stripped their land from him. Right? Let's not Trail of Tears Part 2. We want to keep this pretty moral. They also say that Russia can do a lot of bad stuff. That's why we don't want to anger them. But we tell you that Russia has capitulated in the status quo. They're not going to stop natural gas shipments in the status quo. They are weak now, and they're accepting this ceasefire. We want this ceasefire to stay in place so that they agree to this regional autonomy. We don't want to keep on poking Russia because we do think they can do things like cut off gas, and they will when they're forced to defend these border towns that are so very important. That's what we tell you, and that's what we think is important at the end of the day. And finally, we do think that the economic argument is important. Donetsk and Luhansk produces 40% of the Ukrainian industry. When those things are gone, Ukraine has no economy. This desperation will lead to more violence and reaching out to fight the very state that they blame for their poverty. They get violence on their side. We're going to talk to you why that's so bad. We tell you that a two-state solution, this is my split, a two-state solution is never something, in this case, that should be ideologically endorsed. Why? Because we think that ethnicity is just one of the multiple identities for which people can discriminate or for which people can be violent. They're forced to, in these situations, they should be forced to learn how to reconcile and coexist. Why? Well, one, we think there are more ethnicities in these places than just Russia, than Russian and Ukrainian. There are native people of the Tartars. But secondarily, we think there are other identities. The LGBTQ are someone that we need to talk about in this realm because they are oftentimes heavily discriminated against in these Slavic regions. We think that a two-state solution only perpetuates this violence because it justifies the narrative that if you are too violent, you can just force out the people that are unlike you. The ones that are different don't belong in the same place. We saw this in Crimea. When Russia said, we own this, they did things like expel the Tartars because the Tartars didn't belong in part of this ethnic Russian identity. But more importantly, you see this all over the place. In South Sudan, Israel, Palestine, that the conflict intrastate becomes heavier because there's always someone to otherize, there is always someone against whom they can be violent. We think the most vulnerable groups are these native populations, the LGBTQ, and we think that we have a special responsibility to help protect them because they have been historically disadvantaged. We as the West ignored them for centuries. It is time that we start sticking up for them. And we think that when you create a two-state solution, you justify this violence. You justify not accepting those who don't match your identity 100%. Go.
Right, the thing about these border towns is that right now they're still uncertain. People are still willing to fight over them because they're still unspoken for border towns. Our plan gives us the ability to firmly determine whose hands these fall in and stop giving people the opportunity to keep fighting for something we're uncertain about.
Well, they're not firing now, but we tell that uncertainty is good. When they say, I can be part of this autonomous Russian group, but I'm also Ukrainian, we think that uncertainty is perfect for these towns that are split 50-50, because in your world, those towns that are split 50-50 are going to be the center of violence and are going to spark conflict. Let's talk about the international precedents. So Ukraine has actually been promised in the Budapest Accords of 1994 that Western powers like the USA and the UK would explicitly protect their territorial integrity if they gave up nuclear weapons. Russia was even a signee to this treaty. Why is this important? Because we think that these accords are incredibly important at establishing precedents, because our ability to persuade future leaders to give up things like chemical, biological weapons, or even nuclear weapons depends on our ability to keep these accords. We think that's why the U.S. is pressing hard to protect their territorial integrity, because while we're trying to convince Iran that if they give up their nuclear weapons, we'll respect them, they're saying, no, look at Ukraine, they give up the nuclear weapons and no one respects them. We think that that only strengthens their arguments and makes it much more difficult to have a stable, peaceful environment where people aren't armed with biological and chemical weapons. It just came out that Assad retained some of his chemical weapons and is starting to use them again. Why? Because he feels that the U.S. never keeps their promise about anything when it comes to disarming yourself. But we also think it's important that we shouldn't allow people in other countries to grab certain areas of sovereign states and say, this is now mine. When you do that, you justify the narrative that China's trying to push on, which is like, Taiwan should be ours, we'll go and grab that. We think that by allowing them to grab this territory, you make the world less safe. You make Ukraine less safe. We're proud to oppose.
This House would like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition and welcome the Member of Government.
We think it's pretty shameful that opening opposition's case is all predicated on this idea that it's so bad that these people are in this situation and we can never force them to move. What is going on right now in Ukraine? People are being forced to move under the threat of death. They are literally being saying they're having to decide whether they should be killed or whether they want to continue moving. At that point, that's their assumption. We would always uphold the people's right to life, right? The people's right to safety. We think the government's model better provides the safety because people don't have to continually go to war. And we think that the choice to move under the choice of peace is always better than under the choice of war, and that's why we think a two-state solution is best. We'll provide some rebuttal on the outcome point of positive matter, ultimately concluding with what stabilizes Putin, because we think that's really been missing in the round today. So let's get on to the first speaker. Trevor says that Russia's scared and they want respect. Look, respect is merely a guise for economics for Putin. Because Putin is actually controlled by larger oligarchs in the country. And when those oligarchs don't have the oil money to continue existing, then they get a new government, right? They'll get a new leader. Ultimately, economics is what controls Putin. And that's why we think that by creating a two-state solution, as we'll tell you, this controls the economic situation. But the whole point that he just wants respect is merely not enough. Just saying that is not true. Trevor tells you that there's going to be constant violence and the two-state solution under won't work. Look, the constant violence only occurs at the point where this war will continue to go on forever, and that's what we'll bring you today in our first point of positive matter. At the point where these nations are parried in strength, where Ukraine can never truly gain the territory that they lost, and Russia will always continue to push because their weapons are about equal, we think this violence will continue forever. That's what creates continual ethnic violence. Trevor says that people identify with their land, right? But people want to live in a state that they feel safe, right? People can change their identity with the land when they emigrate to a place. That's why people are able to move states ultimately. Yes, it is so harmful when people have to lose their land, but it's also more harmful when people lose their lives. Trevor says that, right now, there's just going to be this whole problem with economics. Look, we think that Russia will ultimately end up partially backing this new state. And that's where their economic power will come from. And the West, through NATO and the EU, will ultimately back the West. That's what's ultimately going to happen. Finally, the status quo solves the ceasefire working. I think that's pretty easy for Trevor to say as he's sitting on a bench in San Luis Obispo. But when you are in Ukraine and you have a gun to your head, right, and your neighbors are being killed around you and there's ethnic cleansing, no, not so easy to say. Finally, so Stephen says that the violence is going to be state on state. Look, Yemen tried both of these, right? Being separate and being together. Ultimately, Yemen was most stable when they were separate because the governments were able to actually create a state and create a stability, and people chose which region they wanted to live in. Only when did these states combine together did we see this violence occur? Did we see the current Houthi crisis in Yemen? She even says that we can't just leave this alone because we can't just look, you ask people, like people can't just leave. You ask people to move and flee right now. Over 1 million people have fled out of the eastern region. Our model at least provides people with a choice that's not just death. And we ultimately don't think this is going to happen like it happened in Kosovo. Because we don't think that Ukraine is going to want the land back, right? We don't think that Serbia's attacks on Kosovo will happen in the Ukraine model. We think Ukraine will probably find better stability. Finally, this creates this precedent that those who expel don't belong. But that's not fleshed out enough. But again, this is what Putin is doing right now. We say that people feel like they belong when they have a state that actually represents them. Who is feeling like they're not represented? The people in the West right now, whose government literally got overthrown because people expressed their interest to be in NATO. Those people also feel like they don't belong. And we feel like in a world where we can create two states, those people would feel like they belong and the people in the East. Oh, sorry, finally, the whole Budapest Accords. Yeah, sure, probably why NATO can support this new state, like NATO can come through. So why will the status quo never solve? This is our first extension. Russia is supplying weapons to the soldiers, but Ukraine are getting weapons from the UAE. These weapons are about equal. That means that they're going to parry each other, right? So ultimately, this war will continue forever, and this ethnic violence will continue forever under the status quo. That's why the status quo doesn't solve, because we don't want war to continue forever. So both Gov and Ops, worst case scenario, is that war is going to continue forever. What do we provide you? We provide, I'll provide you no hope for solvency, that this is just going to continue to forever, and hopefully at some point Putin will listen to a peace accord, right? No, at the point where Putin's oil price is continuing to drop, he's not going to continue to listen to any more peace. He's not going to continue to do anything besides continue to move west, continue to grab more land, no thank you, and we don't think that's going to help. We at least provide you a case that, they could, that there is a chance for peace, that these nations ultimately could become peaceful. Yes, no thank you. Yes, there is there is bad border between South Korea, North Korea, and Pakistan, India. But we haven't seen a war, right? We haven't seen a war between North Korea and South Korea in decades. And these people feel safe. That's why South Korea was able to industrialize and not feel yes, there is some feeling of scaredness of North Korea, but at least they're not under the North Korean regime. No, thank you. So let's get on to natural gas. So what do we think this is going to do for natural gas? At the point where 40%, and how does this relate to Ukraine? At the point where 40% of EU gas goes through Ukraine, this is so harmful because the EU's industry is getting severely cut off and severely harmed. That's why the status quo is even worse, because the EU is also getting harmed by this. And when the EU is getting harmed, it makes it let their ability to help Ukraine be even less, because it's hard to convince your populace to help someone else when your oil price, when you literally don't have natural gas steam.
Right. You say the status quo isn't solving, but Russia has capitulated, granting the ceasefire. The last fired shot was literally weeks ago. Okay. How is this not solving?
Yes, and you could say that the last fired shot was weeks ago when they signed the last peace treaty, and then Putin continued to move, right? Saying that it hasn't happened in 2 weeks doesn't make it solved. You have to look at the past. He did the same thing in Georgia. He will continue to move. Ultimately, the natural gas point is it's really bad, right? This is so bad because Russia controls the natural gas lines, but by 2016, there's going to be natural gas ports that come from the U.S. that go to Germany, France, and so this is what we need is time. After we created a ceasefire and they actually created a solution in Georgia, Putin stopped for 6 years, which we think is enough time to create some sort of stability in the region. Ultimately, what stabilizes Putin? Because that's what's most important. Putin is most stabilized when he's actually working with the U.S. Why is this true? In 2010, Putin OAE Rosneft signed a deal worth $2.8 billion with Shell in the Arctic. Why did this work? Because Russia's break-even price is $80 on a barrel of oil, because they're using 1950s and 1960s technology. That's why the Arctic deal worked, because they worked with the U.S. and they were able to get better technology. So what's the best world post model? We think the best world post model is when Russia actually gets onto the talking table with the U.S., works with them economically, and we can actually, the U.S. can actually check them and say, hey, we're going to cut off your money you're making from every oil deal unless you stop this. Because right now we have no control over what Putin's doing, because he controls the oil, he controls the natural gas line. After a two-state solution, we think he's much more likely to work with the United States, much more likely to go into joint deals that we can actually have some leverage over. That means the best world post model is one where Putin's actually on the table with the U.S. and working together to stabilize the region. Yes, Putin is a bad guy, but it's better if we are actually talking with him instead of letting him take over regions. And that's why we think the two-state solution is best. Thanks.
This House would like to thank the Member of Government and welcome the Member of Opposition.
We on both sides, I think, can equally say that we want the best world. We want to stop the violence in these areas. We want to resolve as many differences as possible. We want to have world peace. We think that on side opposition, by creating a two-state solution, we are not going to be getting this in post-Mom. We think what we're going to actually be having is increased violence. We're going to be having increased tension. We're going to have increased international stability. And we don't think that we're going to be solving for the natural gas problems of and helping the EU with that. We think that we have missed some historical analysis here, which I'm going to be adding to this round. I will then be talking about polarization between the East and West, and how we're going to add on to the idea of increasing violence in this area. So first I want to talk a little bit about why, historically, we don't believe that these problems are actually as deeply rooted as side government has presented today. We think that when Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine in the 1950s, that was quite a long time ago. Since that time, though there have still been ethnic Russians in Crimea all of this time, there have not been the same level of violence that we've been seeing today. They've been able to get along rather peacefully for decades. We think that there are a few reasons that right now, it came to today, modern day, that there was actually these problems. We think the main reason that this happened is because when Ukraine voted to make, in Crimea, in Kiev, they voted to make Ukrainian the official language of Ukraine. What did this do? This actually was a direct attack at the ethnic Russians in Ukraine, and we think that that is why, when you look at what actually happened, the Western world is actually marking the beginning of this revolution when rebels started entering Ukraine. When Russia actually marks the beginning of this revolution is when Ukraine voted to make Ukrainian the official language of this area. That upset the Russians. And we think that when you see that they didn't have issues before then, we think that these ethnic disparities, while they can be problematic and can clearly flare up, they're not as deeply problematic as side government wants you to believe. We do think it's solvable. We do think we can have people living side by side. And we think that for these reasons, because there are harms coming from a two-state situation that I will be talking about further, we think that we should not be implementing what side government is proposing. I'll take your point.
I think it's kind of silly that she's like, the only reason these people have ever wanted to fight is because of that one language law. Like, no, this is a lot more complicated than that. We admit that both sides have interests. In the status quo, neither side has anything they want. We think our policy is the best compromise to help both sides and end fighting.
Right, okay, so I'm not saying that language is the only reason that that this happened. We're saying that this was the kind of flare-up that you see when someone instigates something that they know is directly going to upset people that live in their region. We think that when you make those policies, you are necessarily undertaking the risk that you're going to have increased violence, but we think that proven by the fact that Crimea has been a part of Ukraine since the 1950s and they did not have this level of violence up until recently, it's clear that these people can get along easily. Okay, so going on to a few points of rebuttal before I get into my main points. When you're looking at side government, I find it interesting because they're talking about if we make these into a two-state solution, we're going to just have people in these different areas. And if people want to identify with that area, they can just move. I think what's interesting is that they literally chose to make these two states, either part of Ukraine or part of Russia. We think that this is basically a little bit of the status quo. Why do we have to why do we have to break this up even more? If people value that connection so much, we think that they could just actually easily move without making this two-state solution right now. If they feel that strongly in the status quo, without implementing this, without causing some of the harms, they could do this right now. But secondly, we do think that people should be living together. We think that that was a more valuable idea in this round. We think that proven by the fact that people were living together very peacefully beforehand, we should be pursuing that route. We should be trying to de-escalate the situation. We should be trying to actually polarize these differences by creating a two-state situation. So we think that we think that there is going to be polarization between Eastern and Western values if you do this. We think, as side government brought up, that the EU and the United States are going to be involved in this area. And as side government brought up, we do think that NATO may be involved in bringing in parts of Ukraine into NATO. And we think that what's going to happen is that it's going to increase the polarization between these regions. Why? Because when we look at how we've divided areas under Western and Eastern control in the past, for example, Western and Eastern Germany, we think that that has been created a huge disparity between the quality of life that people have in these areas. We think that Russia is not necessarily going to be as interested in creating this greater area for these people, and we think that by having NATO specifically, and the EU, and the United States being involved with helping Ukraine become a stronger, regional power, that's going to upset Putin, and Russia in general, because when we made nuclear agreements to get rid of our nuclear weapons, part of that deal explicitly said that we are not going to have NATO involved in Russia's sphere of influence. So what we think is that when you actually get to the point where you have all of these Western influences and Western powers up against Russia's back door, we think that that's going to actually increase the amount of nationalization that you already see on the rise in Russia today. You're going to increase the amount or likelihood of violence between these two groups because people are going to be having more and more of a different culture and more of a different background. You don't have that when on our side of the house, when if you do, you can just choose to move, or we actually try and implement real solutions to the problems where we try and actually get these two groups together. I'll take back.
Yeah, Putin was a signer of the Budapest Accords, as opening opposition pointed out. But we'd also like to say Putin's ultimate goal is economic stability. We think that you have to address how at least this is going to bring about economic stability for the region.
Yes, I agree. We should have economic stability in this region. We also think that the natural gas flow that comes from Russia going through Ukraine to the EU is important. And we think that if you have this increased violence and increased tension between these two groups, you're not solving for that on side government. In fact, you're making it worse, as I was just pointing out. So if you're actually going to harm the EU more in this situation, we think you're not going to benefit from that. You're going to be increasing the violence in that region by NATO and the EU and the US trying to make and prop up Ukraine as more of a Western regional power. And we think that that is, again, going to upset Russia, because if they hate each other as much as side government is trying to make you seem, to present, then we think that that's going to be problematic. So we think that on our side, the best world is going to be when you actually allow people to, you don't force people into this two-state situation. We agree that there are different ethnic groups. What we don't agree is that they're going to necessarily be at each other's throats all the time. We think that they were able to live before, and we think that for these reasons, we strongly oppose. Thank you.
This House would like to thank the member of opposition and welcome the government whip to close out the case for the government bench.
It's pretty problematic when they base their entire case on the fact that they got along in the past. Lots of people got along in the past. The Sunnis and Shia got along in the past until it got ignited. It's really hard to stop these conflicts once they've been ignited. And that's why we're proud to propose that we think a two-state solution is best in today's round. So I'm going to have 2 points of crystallization. My first is how do we end this conflict? And my second is when is Putin most stable? So how do we end this conflict? Well, they come up here and start and say that this conflict is all about Putin wanting respect for his people, right? I don't think Putin just cares about respect. He probably also cares about oil, his economy, his military. He just uses it as a guy. It's completely irrational to assume that it's all based on respect for Putin, right? He cares about his economy most. He cares about his money the most. And then they come up here and say, this two-state violence is going to be unsolvable, and they try to give all these examples of when it's not working, right? But we still say India and Pakistan. Has there been all this death that was happening before this two-state solution? No, there's not all this death anymore. We think that's essential. We say we're not able to solve all this violence, but at least we can have the ability to solve in the future, right? They have no ability to solve in the future because they're just saying we're going to keep with these ceasefires that are not working and historically have not been working, right? And then they come up, closing gov comes up here and says, it's not problematic right now. The status quo is solving, right? The status quo is not solving, right? It's easy to say right now that there's no fighting, but if you're on the ground and seeing Putin's troops moving within your country, that is not violating the ceasefire, but that's still violence, and that's still violating the sovereignty of that country, right? They come up here and say we're not going to get involved because it's harmful, because we signed agreements with Russia to not get involved in these regions because of our nuclear deals. But Russia also signed the Budapest Accords that said that we will make sure we don't violate the sovereignty of Ukraine, and they violate as well. So clearly, once Russia violates this agreement, they have voided that agreement for the nuclear contract, right? Clearly, that is not problematic here, right? So how do we end this conflict? We have some form of solvency. This two-state solution, although not perfect, we're not saying all violence is going to end. We think it's far more likely to help solve this problem of people in their homes dying and actually having some form of peace in the future. Once we can look to Yemen, Nate brings up the example of Yemen. When it was a two-state solution, that was when it was peaceful. If you look now when it's a unified country, that's when we're seeing the Houthis have these conflicts. That's when we're seeing these issues occur because of this one-state solution. But
yeah, literally you haven't answered why they're going to be fighting in the border towns. Because all of your oil impacts are predicated on there being peace. Why won't we fight through the border towns?
Because as we explained, these border towns are going to be solved for because you actually have strict lines of where it's divided. It's not going to be under discussion because it's actually, this is part of that country, this is part of the other. It's a two-state solution. Is it this country's this city's kind of in the middle? No, it's a clear line, a clear division. So it's not going to be a border town conflict you're trying to portray it as. And also, you're not able to industrialize, right? What company is going to go into a country that has these divides and has this constant conflict, right? Not many companies are going to be able to do this, right? We think once you have these stable lines and stable divide, you're going to have the ability to industrialize, the ability to invest in the future of your country. And we think that's essential when you have the ability to invest for the future, because that's when you lead to stability. That's when you lead to what actually is going to lead to long-term peace, because you have that stability, you have that industry, as we've seen with North and South Korea. South Korea was able to industrialize because they weren't having infighting within the peninsula, right? That's what's key, right? We're providing them with at least a choice. The choice to stay in the region and have the conflict that they're talking about, or at least have the ability to go into a region with the people who are of your same ethnicity, and have peace, have this ability for long-term peace. And they provide no choice. We've shown you, Nate showed you, that the status quo is not able to solve. My second point, when is Putin most stable? This is the reason we having this discussion, because Putin is an unstable actor. We think Putin's most stable when we have discussions with him, when we make concessions with Putin to ensure that this conflict is going to be solved for the long term. We think in the past when we've had discussions with Putin, with Shell Rosneft discussion, when we had that discussion, we were able to have the long-term solvency of Putin having the ability to discuss with the West and make decisions with the West, have involvement of Western corporations in Russia, in Ukraine, and make sure that we don't have this conflict, right? We're able to stabilize the region through economic activity. Because what really solves for conflict is economic stability. You're not going to see that on their side because they're going to have zero economic stability on their side because there's going to be constant conflict, right? And we really see there's the point about all he cares about is respect. That is simply not true. He cares about his economy. The economy is key, and that's what he's really going for. So they try to, Opening Gov comes up here and says the native population is going to be exploited, and that's super harmful, and they're going to solve for it. No, they're not solving for it. They're simply covering it up. We're actually allowing these states to have a solution within their border, where they're able to actually have a stable government, which will then help these people. If it's a region with anarchy, then clearly those people are going to be their sovereignty will be violated. So what have we brought to you today? Nate brought to you that the status quo is not solving right now. The status quo is unable to solve. They've never shown you why the status quo will solve. We at least have the ability in the future to have this solvency. And they really explain, they're unable to explain why we can't solve, and they can't solve in the status quo. And secondly, when is Putin most stable? We believe Putin's most stable when we have these concessions, when we have the ability to have economic growth, and we have the ability to have this industry develop, so we actually have stability, because when you have a stable economy, it's much less likely for you to have conflict. That's why we're proud to propose. Thank you.
This House would like to thank the government whip and welcome the opposition whip to close out the case for the opposition bench.
Now, basically, the whole crux of the argument that we've seen from the government side is this idea that Putin is this backstabbing dictator. They say that, you know what, it's completely irrational for us to use what the Russian government is saying as their objective. It's completely irrational for us to believe that they're just doing this because they want the respect everywhere. But of course, we have to take into account that Putin wants undermine these goals that he's not expressing. But we see that this simply is the irrational thing to do. What we have to see is we look at the real situation, what we know as a fact. What we know is that we do no longer have violence in the status quo in the area, and diplomatic talks are being reached. And now that is critical. Why break up the state when right now we already have a diplomatic solution being worked out? It's simply breaking something that's already being fixed. Why do we need to break it up again? All it's going to do is make it worse. Now this moves us into the four major issues that we have in this round. Now the first issue is going to be basically the empirical evidence. Has this worked or has it not worked in the past? Now the next is going to be violence, whether or not we'll stop it. The third being basically Ukraine and the impacts of that. And the fourth being basically this idea of, can we have mass immigrations and can people just move between the two states? Before I go on.
Right, he says that we're simply breaking something that's already being fixed. The reality is, ladies and gentlemen, when you break a bone, if it starts to heal wrong, sometimes you have to break it again in order to make sure that it heals properly. We think the best situation here is to actually make sure that this bone heals properly so you don't have future issues.
We agree. We think that we should heal the bone properly, which is why we let the diplomatic talks continue, why we let them make a solution that works for the people of the Ukraine, and why we let an actual solution become about. We can't just stop them while they're in the middle of diplomatic talks. That doesn't solve anything. But I'll move on to the main issue. So the first one is the empirical evidence. So we bring up issues. They say, look at India and Pakistan. We've decreased the violence in the region. I mean, that's just simply false. The Kashmiri region is one of the most contested regions in the world. It is one of the highest rates of violence. We're not decreasing it, we're increasing it. We look at East and West Germany, where we had extreme polarization when we split it up. Israel, Palestine, we need to talk about how bad it's become there. And we look at North and South Korea, where they say that, look, now it's so nice for South Korea because they don't have any fear, which is, first of all, false. And second, because they live in fear every day of an oppressive dictator who's actually threatened nuclear attacks on them always. And what we see is that they have the crux of their argument here is they say that, look, we see industrialization of this two-state solution. And we agree there's industrialization inside of South Korea. But let's look to the other half, North Korea. They're not very industrialized. Actually, what we see is oppressed people who are starving because of a tyrannical dictator. Two-state solutions do not work. That is shown empirically. But now we move on to basically the violence and whether or not we're going to stop it, because this has become obviously the major issue. So what we see in the status quo is right now there's no violence. Right now there's a ceasefire. Now they said, well, no. Maybe they're not killing people, but they're moving troops in there, and that's violence. But that's not violence. I mean, they want the same thing to happen. They just want to make US peacekeepers in there anyway, which actually do nothing. What you see is that we actually have violence stop now, and we are trying to let a diplomatic talk be reached. And you know what? Yeah, if it breaks out into another war, then maybe we can talk about it. But we've stopped the violence effectively, and we're letting them reach a diplomatic decision. It is not the time to make a drastic move, like cut up the country in the middle of it. You think that this is going to stop violence? All this is going to do is destabilize the region and increase violence. What you see is that it's a rebel issue. It's about these rebels fighting against each other. So do you think they're going to like it when you now give half the country to Ukraine? No, what you need is for the people as a whole to come to a decision that they all get behind. That is how we make lasting issues. What you see, they don't address the issue of these border attacks. And they say, okay, so we're going to stop border violence because we're going to make a border. Well, yeah, they already exist. These places aren't just in some limbo. They were in one country, and other people wanted them, so that they attacked it and tried to take it back. That's how it works. A country will always be owned by one or another, and there will always be attacks in these border towns. To say that they're just going to go away because now we have better lines is simply irrational. People do things because they have the motive, they have an economic motive, and it's still going to happen. Now we move into the third issue, which is basically the benefit for Ukraine, since this is Ukraine. And first of all, we've already gone into the fact that if we do actually bring in NATO to help them in this situation, that we are going to anger Russia, we are going to destabilize the region even more, since Putin has said that we do not want NATO, and we have signed treaties to say that. They said that Putin has broken treaties, therefore we can just do whatever we want. But that's the most childish way of looking at international relations ever. You don't simply just fight back at them because he did something you don't like. You become the bigger man, and you become a bastion of basically proper morals inside of the international community. So now what you see is that by taking away Crimea from the Ukraine, what you're going to do is you basically cripple them because you take away the seaports. So we agree, maybe it is like South Korea and North Korea where there's not that much fighting. But it's also going to be like South Korea, making the region worse and more destabilized. So now we move on to basically the final issue, which is the mass immigration, which the whole basis of their case is that we shouldn't make people get along. People shouldn't have to like each other based on their ethnicities or nationalities. But instead, they should just move to a new country. We think that's not correct. We live in an international civilization where, you know what? You should be able to accept your neighbors for whatever nationality, or for whatever beliefs they have. We're not going to say, you know what? Let's make a new country because you don't like that race. That's not the ideas that we need to be enforcing. We don't just say that because people are fighting, because you know what, I want to be a Russian, I want to be a Ukrainian, that you know what, we're just going to make everyone move. Because we see is people don't move. This is an international society, and if people really hate them that much, then go move back to Russia. But you know what? That doesn't happen. Because we live in an international world where we need to be enforcing the ideas that it is more important to accept people for whatever nationality they are, for whatever principles they believe in, than it is to simply segregate people into different places based on nationality, based on skin color, based on anything. That's what we've seen critically. That's what we all know intuitively. What we see is that it just simply doesn't make sense to make two solutions because one people doesn't like another. What we need to be encouraging is not segregation, but cohesion. But working people together, making a cohesive society, that's what causes this lack of destabilization. That's what causes stabilization. That's what causes things to get better. We've shown throughout that looking at the empirical evidence, two states don't work. We see that we're going to increase violence by destabilizing the region, and by not letting the diplomatic solution emerge. We've shown that Ukraine is going to be crippled economically, and we've shown that, you know what, we need to have a moral obligation here to make the world a better place, to encourage people to live together. And for those reasons, we believe that you must give a negative ballot. Thank you.